Federal unemployment benefits have officially expired for millions of Americans. The Century Foundation estimates at least 7.5 million people in the U.S. lost aid assistance abruptly after emergency programs came to an end yesterday without pushback from the Biden administration. Another 3 million will lose the $300 weekly supplement. The White House has encouraged some states to continue helping the long-term unemployed, but hopes the end of aid will push more Americans to return to work. Many businesses nationwide are dealing with a labor shortage as the Delta variant continues to rattle as we try to recover from the pandemic. Well, statewide protections put in place in New Jersey for workers there during the peak of the coronavirus pandemic have been rolled back now. The end of the state's public health emergency also closed an outlet for complaints. Thousands have been filed since last November, accusing employers of not doing enough to keep people safe on the job. An article in Gothamist looks at some of the worst offenders, and WNYC reporter Karen Yee wrote the piece. She joins me now with more. So, Karen, hundreds of complaints. I suppose it's not surprising. Walk us through what you found and what were sort of the most likely complaints to come up.
Sure. So these complaints were filed under an executive order created by Governor Phil Murphy. At the time, we didn't know what to do, right? Employers had no guidebook as to how to keep their workers safe. So he created this executive order that was sort of like a Bible, telling companies social distancing, cleaning protocols, masking requirements in order to keep their people safe. And through this executive order, he also created this complaint portal where workers could lodge complaints if their employers weren't abiding by these rules. And so between October to June, there was 3,300 complaints filed. And we were able to obtain about 2,700 of them. And looking through these records, I mean, you can imagine there was complaints of all kinds. I mean, dental assistants wearing raincoats for protective gear, a preschool where, all the night custodian crew was out sick, yet the school stayed open, even though there was no one to clean it up. A lot of workers complained of their managers letting sick people come into work, either people who had tested positive for COVID or who had some COVID-like symptoms. And then there was, a couple companies where the employers were saying, my boss doesn't even believe this virus is real.
Oh my gosh. I'm sort of guessing that the restaurant industry had the most complaints because it feels like, aside from sort of transit workers and so on, they were kind of on the front line, and it was very difficult to determine just how to keep restaurants open and still keep people safe. So give me a sense of what industry saw the most complaints.
Right. And, let's remember back at that time in October, the complaints portal really started in November. Indoor dining was resuming, right? The New Jersey and a lot of other states. New Jersey was a little bit later to reopen, but we had indoor dining coming back. And so as you can see, restaurants were top of the list. You had government services, clerical, food service. To me, the surprising thing was car dealerships, but you also had schools. This was a time where the state was once again allowing in-person schooling for kids, even if it was like a hybrid model. And so a lot of these industries make sense given where we were in the state in terms of the recovery and the reopening. And a lot of places, some companies got multiple complaints from employees. And, I was doing a lot of reporting on essential workers throughout that time. And there was workers that I reported on that I didn't see their complaints in here. And so this was still a limited sample, right? I mean, 3,300 sounds like a lot, but this was, again, an online form. And so some employees maybe didn't have access to the internet to file these complaints. Some employees maybe didn't know that this was an option to file a complaint. But we did get to see a window, right? A window into, as people were coming back, sort of into the world, what the people who were serving us were feeling and what they were scared of. A lot of fear going into these workplaces, but also, the need to have to pay their bills, right? And the need to have to make money and having to go into work despite their nerves and despite this virus that we knew little about.
So did the state of New Jersey even have the resources to follow up on all of these complaints? And then the complaints that were followed up on, what was the resolution? I mean, did they have the ability to fine these businesses if they didn't adhere to the guidelines, or what was the deal there?
So the complaint, once you filed a complaint, that was handled by the Department of Labor. And as you know, the Department of Labor was very busy at the time, right, with unemployment claims. The Department of Labor told me that they dedicated 51 staff members and hired 10 temporary staff members to sort through these complaints. But they did admit that there were no in-person inspections. And so when a complaint was filed, somebody reviewed it, made a call, made an email. All of this was done remotely. They said for the most part, employers complied after they were told and were forced to either provide evidence through a photograph of that they had fixed something, or through purchase orders, they had finally purchased certain supplies. But that's what some of the labor advocates complained about, right? That the enforcement wasn't really there. It was kind of an honor system, right? And it was just, in many cases, a call from the state is enough to scare an employer and get them to do the right thing. But not in every case, right? There were some instances where the employees were still complaining of certain conditions, unsafe conditions, and there had to be more action done by labor advocates or by the employees themselves, protesting, writing a letter, et cetera. So I think the state under the executive order did have the power to shut businesses down and have the power to subpoena businesses for information. But I was told that didn't happen.
So now we have the Delta variant, but the health emergency has been lifted. Is there any outlet for employers who are concerned about their safety, or employees rather?
Right now, it's really up to each individual employer to determine these guidelines. And so this executive order expired in July, right, when the public health emergency expired. And so while Governor Murphy has clamped down on certain industries requiring masking in schools, for example, or having a vaccine or test requirement in certain industries, healthcare, prisons, and for teachers as well, everyone else, it's pretty much up to your employer. I mean, we've seen some companies implement masking policies, some companies implementing vaccine requirements, but there is no blanket sort of this general guidebook that we had last year and into the beginning of this year.
Wow, and we are definitely not out of the woods when it comes to the pandemic yet. Karen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.